for China to invade Taiwan, it is a significantly heavier lift for China, even than D-Day was for the Allies. It's an incredible distance. You have to remember, D-Day is the only comparative point we have of an amphibious operation of that size. Perhaps MacArthur in the Philippines as well, because it's on different fronts, but it was an enormous operation, D-Day. And D-Day comes in year 4 or year 5 of total war for all of the Allies. So all of their economies, their directing minds, their smartest people, etc., are all focused on the war effort, and a large part of that war effort goes to D-Day. For China, invading Taiwan is significantly harder than D-Day. Plus, they're dealing not just with the Americans, they're dealing with the Japanese, they're dealing with a whole array of other players who have no interest in China taking Taiwan. So it's an incredibly hard thing to do. Just the amphibious assault alone and the lodgement on day one would be very, very hard. We live in a completely transparent battlefield. If you look at Russia and Ukraine, why do the front lines not move? It's because we have a completely transparent battlefield. I mean, it's very, very hard to do things in a secretive way. But I mean, to go back to our point about Israel and Hamas, I think one of the reasons why you have such a shock factor in Israel is that Israel is the one country you would expect doesn't get surprised. So yes. I'll just put that to one side without going back to it. But we do generally live in an era of transparent battlefields where we watch, nations watch each other. It's very cheap and very cost effective to watch and to see what your potential adversary is doing. So it is not like China could just simply invade Taiwan in a sort of massive amphibious assault. It would be very bad. Day one would be perhaps the only good day. Day two would be terrible, and so on and so forth. Also, China is as I point out to people, China is a nation of one-child family, often a son. The ambition of most Chinese parents is not to have their one son die in a very short war with the Americans that they will lose. And for regime stability, if you're President Xi, when you wake up in the morning, you've got 1.2 to 1.3 billion problems before you start thinking about Taiwan. You have your own people to be concerned about. You have obviously your own military to be concerned about. You can see this in open source. Xi every now and then is always firing PLA generals, etc., for corruption. I mean, the facts are, if you're a general in the PLA, you're generally there to make money, not war. And so the idea of wasting all that position on a war in Taiwan that you're most certainly going to lose is not going to be something that's good. So my own view on China is be wary, obviously watch it, but don't overhype the threat, and also don't back the Chinese into a corner where they actually do have to build a massive military machine to save face.
Right.
The West at the moment has a military preponderance over the Chinese. We have much better air power, we have much better naval power. Don't rub that in. That's something where let them have their odd bit of chest beating and so on like that, but don't make a big issue of it. Handle it like a mature adult. And I think the one big problem that China will have is that it's going to get older before it gets powerful. And I think that's something to bear in mind. So I guess put me down in the sort of small H hawk camp.
Fair enough. So let me put to you a couple of... Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, but put to that point about, I think, again, with China, you have to sometimes let the chest beating and the complaints and what the Russians call China's last demand. You sometimes have to let the Chinese get it out of them and not humiliate them. Just let them get it out of them. And you have to realize they are a great civilization as well. And they're a civilization that's always going to be there. They have an enormous diaspora. I live in a country with a large Chinese diaspora. There's no point in having arguments for the sake of arguments. And deal with the Chinese and work with them where you can, and where you cannot work with them, differ. But don't make a big issue of it. The facts are we have a very good military alliance between ourselves, the Americans, the Japanese. Obviously, we hope one day to have the Indians in the Quad. Have that develop into something much more than just an agreement to meet every now and then. Obviously, the problem there is that the West has difficult relations with Russia, and India is never going to give up its relationship with Russia. So, but at the moment, the Chinese issue or the Chinese threat, I think, can be overstated. That doesn't mean you go along with, say, the idiocies of people who think it's all the sort of panda hugging people who sort of almost want disarmament. But you just be quite realistic about things, and you deal with the Chinese threat in a really sober and sensible way.
So there was a study by an Australian institute that I'll try to remember the name, and I'll put it in the links in this episode, that looked at different kinds of technologies of the future and found that the Chinese were now leading in, I believe it was 58 out of 64 of these technologies. including a bunch of technologies with very important military applications. So that's one side of it. The second side of it is that just as the United States spends 10 times on its military than the next 10 countries, spends more on its military than the next 10 countries put together, the Chinese now produce manufactured goods more than the 10 next countries put together. So the ability of China to get into a long war on the manufacturing side is impressive. I think you've always made the point about China's need for imports and for imported raw materials and imported food as being critical. They've obviously been stockpiling. Why, we don't know, but they seem concerned about this. And now they have this connection to Russia that's much deeper alliance with Russia. So I just wanted to get your views on how you see that. I've heard American generals say that in a shooting war, the U.S. would lose. So flesh out your argument a little bit.
Yeah, I would just say to people who say, I mean, I'm always conscious of other people having differing views, and that's fine. But I would just say the last war the Chinese fought was against Vietnam in 1979. They've not fought an actual war since then. The war they fought against Vietnam in 1979, they basically lost. They had to declare victory and go home. War is not something that you sort of turn up in and have a brilliant debut. It's a hard school. And if you haven't fought one, particularly one that's going to be of the scale that's envisaged over Taiwan, it's not something that you're going to have a lot of margin for error for, and yet error is all you're going to have if this is your first war in, the better part of 50 years. So that's the first thing I'd say. Secondly, if Chinese military technology is so good, where is the Chinese F-35? Where is the Chinese Seawolf? I always pull out the example of the Seawolf. It was a brief submarine class the Americans built during the Cold War and they didn't persist with. But the facts are the Americans built it and then put it to one side when they figured it didn't work for them. Chinese still haven't come close to anything like that. I mean, the technological gaps that exist in real war that you can point to versus assertions as to what Chinese capabilities may or may not be. I mean, the facts are they still use the Badger bomber. The Badger was something the Soviets had in the 60s and 70s. I mean, it's the technology just isn't there. And so I'm not saying it might not be. It may be there in 10 years' time, but I'm just saying at the moment, it's not something that keeps me awake at night. Now, on your manufacturing point, that's an excellent point, and that's why I think anyone who is a conservative realist like I am, you're very concerned by the West basically gutting itself from an industrial strength point of view. And I would have thought COVID would have woken up a lot of people in the West. The fact that we don't make things anymore, we were so terribly dependent on foreign supply chains for medicines, even for basic things like masks. Now, a lot of that was cleaned up very quickly. You had distilleries for alcohol, making hand sanitizer. You had clothing manufacturers making masks. So that did go into that did work. I remember when Trump was president the first time, he had the big motor companies making ventilators. I think America's got a massive stockpile of ventilators now. I mean, you can do it, but the point is you have to have that industrial base. So yes. I think one of the lessons I think for the West is the industrial base. And again, as someone who goes on and on about energy issues, I mean, I practice in the area, but I go on about energy issues because energy is everything.
Yes.
If you don't have an industrial base and you don't have a efficient, economical, and reliable way of powering it, I sort of don't know how you sustain yourself as a nation state, let alone in a wartime situation. So that's sort of what my take on it. But in relation to all the claims that the Chinese are doing very well in AI, this, they're like, for instance, people say, well, they're doing very well in medicine. When was the last time you heard about, say, like a Gulf emir going off for his surgery to China? I mean, no one actually goes through with it. And so it's like, I'm very interested in people's claims because rising powers occur. But when, say, like Germany was a rising power at the end of the 19th century, no one doubted that the Germans made extremely good. Like, no one doubted the Germans it was very transparent. They could do it. In relation to the Chinese, I mean, they have had an amazing miracle.
So what do you think happened? What do you think happened with India, Pakistan, with the Chinese jets basically massacring the Rafales, as well as apparently a MiG and a Sukhoi?
Can I be honest with you? I haven't seen a lot of that in any domain. I would want to look more at that. I do know that by the way, just to be clear, I didn't say that Russian technology. I said that Chinese technology. I'm just saying there's not like a Chinese equivalent of the F-35. I mean, there is actually no equivalent of the F-35 everywhere. Right, Russians do make very, very good kit. They might not use it as well as perhaps they could, but they do make very, very good kit. The French make very good kit. I mean, that's sort of like a peer technology. But if you're saying to me, yeah, do I
what I
worry at
mean,
night that the Chinese?
so the Chinese are making the J-35, which we don't know how
Yeah,
good the J-35 is, and it's fundamentally untested. But the older generation, the J-10, this was used by Pakistan very effectively against India's Rafale jets, which was a fourth generation, 4.5 generation versus equivalent generation. And really, the Indians didn't stand a chance. Now, it could be Indian incompetence, which I have a lot of room for, and I think accounts for a lot in terms of how India operates. But it seemed to me that just on this older technology, the Chinese did a decent job with their equivalent of an F-16 or an F-15, successfully dominating the French equivalent of the same, which makes me wonder, can they replicate the F-35? The number of Chinese spies operating in the West is pretty insane. One of the big problems with multiculturalism is that people remain loyal to their original culture.
If you enjoyed this piece of premium content from the Lotus Eaters, head to our website where you can find more.